Picture this. It is the morning of May 18th, 1565. The Mediterranean sun has barely cleared the horizon, and the sea around the tiny island of Malta lies flat and glittering like hammered bronze. The air smells of salt and wild thyme, and the particular stillness that comes just before the world changes forever. In the harbour, churches, the last bells of morning prayer are fading into silence. Fishermen are pulling in their nets. Children are running along the limestone walls, laughing at nothing in particular, because children always laugh just before the catastrophe arrives. And then, from the southeast, something appears on the horizon. At first, it looks like a darkening of the water, a long, irregular shadow moving against the morning light. But it is not a shadow. It is a fleet. 193 warships moving in perfect formation, their oars rising and falling in synchronized rhythm, their banners snapping in the warm Mediterranean wind. The fleet stretches so far in every direction that men standing on the fortress walls cannot see where it begins or where it ends. It moves like a jeweled serpent across the face of the water, vast and unhurried and utterly certain of itself, carrying 40,000 soldiers, sailors and warriors, representing the most powerful military force on the face of the earth. The Ottoman Empire had arrived. On the walls of Fort St. Angelo, a 71-year-old man in the black robes of the Knights of St. John stood absolutely still and watched the fleet come in. His name was Jean de Valette. He had been fighting Ottomans for most of his adult life. He had once rowed as a slave in their galleys. He had spent the last several years preparing this island for exactly this moment. And now, watching 193 ships fill the horizon, he did not flinch. He did not pray aloud. He did not call for his commanders or reach for his sword. He simply counted. Inside the walls behind him stood approximately 9,000 men. 500 Knights of St. John, warrior monks who had been fighting this same enemy for generations. 900 Spanish soldiers, 800 Italians, thousands of Maltese militiamen, farmers and fishermen who had never asked to be soldiers, but who had nowhere else to go. 9,000 against 40,000. A tiny island of limestone and faith against the full weight of an empire that stretched from Algeria to Mesopotamia, from the Danube River to the Red Sea. The numbers were not close. They had never been close. They were never going to be close. But numbers, as the next 112 days would prove, are only part of the story. If Malta fell, Sicily was next. If Sicily fell, the Italian peninsula lay open. If Italy fell, the road to Rome, to the symbolic heart of Western Christendom, was undefended. The Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent had already taken Rhodes, already reached the gates of Vienna, already turned the eastern Mediterranean into what his admirals called, without exaggeration, an Ottoman lake. Malta was the last serious obstacle between his empire and the complete domination of the Mediterranean world. 9,000 people stood between him and that domination. What happened next? Across 112 days of fire and stone and blood and something that can only be described as pure human refusal, would become, in Voltaire's words, the most famous siege in the world. It would shatter the myth of Ottoman invincibility. It would alter the balance of power in the Mediterranean for generations. And it would prove, in the most brutal terms imaginable, that an empire can send 40,000 men against 9,000 and still, somehow, impossibly, at tremendous cost, lose. This is the Great Siege of Malta, and it changed everything. To understand why 193 ships appeared off the coast of Malta in May of 1565, you have to understand the world they came from. A world in which the Ottoman Empire was not merely powerful, but seemed, to most Europeans alive at the time, genuinely unstoppable. Suleiman I had been Sultan since 1520, and in those 45 years he had transformed the Ottoman Empire into the most formidable military power the world had ever seen. He had conquered Rhodes in 1522, driving out the Knights of St. John, who had defended it for 2 centuries. He had captured Belgrade that same year, opening the door to Central Europe. He had defeated Hungary at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, killing the Hungarian king and eliminating an entire kingdom as an independent entity. He had besieged Vienna in 1529, and though he had ultimately withdrawn, the fact that his armies had reached the gates of the Habsburg capital sent a message across Europe that no diplomat needed to translate. He had broken the Persian Safavid dynasty at the Battle of Chaldiran. He had absorbed Egypt, Syria, and Arabia, making himself master of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and assuming the title of Caliph, spiritual leader of the Islamic world. By 1565, Suleiman controlled territories stretching across 3 continents. His treasury was the richest in the world. His Janissary Corps, the professional soldiers who formed the backbone of his army, were widely considered the finest infantry in existence. His navy, rebuilt and expanded under the genius of admirals like Hayreddin Barbarossa and later Turgut Reis, dominated the eastern Mediterranean so completely that Christian merchant ships moved through those waters only at Suleiman's pleasure. The Mediterranean in the 1560s was not a contested sea. It was an Ottoman sea with certain persistent irritants. Malta was the most persistent of those irritants. The island itself was not impressive to look at. A small, sun-bleached rock in the centre of the sea, barely 17 miles long and 9 miles wide, with poor soil and limited fresh water, and a population of perhaps 20,000 people who had been ruled in succession by Phoenicians, Romans, Arabs, Normans, and various other powers who had found the island strategically useful and agriculturally disappointing. When the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V offered Malta to the Knights of St. John in 1530, after Suleiman had expelled them from Rhodes 8 years earlier, the knights initially hesitated. The island was, by most accounts, a barren and thankless place. But they accepted, because what Malta lacked in soil, it made up for in position. Sit down with a map of the Mediterranean and place your finger in the centre. That is roughly where Malta is. Any ship travelling from the eastern Mediterranean to the western Mediterranean, or from North Africa to Sicily, passes within easy reach of the island. For the Ottomans, who needed their supply lines to run freely between their North African territories and their Eastern Empire, Malta was a dagger pointed at the throat of their naval communications. For the Christians of Western Europe, Malta was a forward outpost, the last Christian bastion before the Ottoman-dominated East. The Knights of St. John understood exactly what they had been given. They were warrior monks, members of a religious order founded during the Crusades to care for pilgrims and fight for Christendom. And in the centuries since their founding, they had become extraordinarily good at the fighting part. Expelled from the Holy Land, then from Cyprus, then from Rhodes, they had retreated with each defeat and emerged each time harder and more dangerous. By 1530 they were, in essence, a highly organized and deeply motivated military corporation, with a single product: violence against the enemies of Christian Europe. From Malta they became pirates, magnificent, righteous, strategically crucial pirates. The man who embodied this mission most completely, at least in the years before the siege, was a corsair named Romegas, a knight whose raids on Ottoman shipping had made him one of the most feared and hated names in the Muslim world. Romegas did not merely raid, he hunted. He tracked Ottoman merchant vessels and warships with methodical patience, struck at moments of maximum vulnerability, and returned to Malta with holds full of goods and decks crowded with prisoners. His exploits became legendary. His name became a curse in the coffeehouses of Istanbul. But it was not Romegas himself who finally pushed Suleiman to act. It was a single voyage in 1564. In that year, Romegas captured a number of ships from the eastern Mediterranean. Among the goods he seized were the possessions of the chief eunuch of the imperial court, a man of enormous influence in Suleiman's household. Among the passengers taken prisoner were the governor of Cairo, the governor of Alexandria, and the personal nurse of one of Suleiman's daughters. These were not random merchants. These were people connected to the Sultan's personal life, to his family, to the intimate circle of his power. Suleiman was 70 years old. He had ruled for 45 years. He had conquered half the known world. And now, a band of Christian pirates on a limestone rock had publicly humiliated him by seizing his household staff like common cargo. The insult was not merely strategic, it was personal. The decision to destroy Malta, and to destroy the knights who held it, had probably been building for years. The capture of Romegas's prizes simply removed whatever restraint remained. Within months, the Ottoman war machine began to move. Shipyards across the empire worked through the winter. Soldiers were levied from across the provinces. Supplies were assembled in quantities that spoke of a campaign expected to last not days, but months. Standing against all of this was Jean de Valette. He was 71 years old in 1565, which in the 16th century was not merely old, but ancient. Born in southern France around 1495, he had entered the Knights of St. John as a young man and spent the next 5 decades fighting. At Rhodes, in the Mediterranean, on the high seas, and in the endless grinding warfare of Christian-Ottoman rivalry that defined his entire adult life. He spoke French, Italian, Spanish, Greek, Arabic, and Turkish fluently. He had served as a galley captain, a fortress commander, an administrator, and a diplomat. In 1557, he had been elected Grand Master of the Knights, the highest position the order could give him. But the fact about de Valette that matters most, the fact that explains almost everything about how the siege would unfold, is this. For 1 year, he had rowed as a slave in an Ottoman galley. In 1541, his ship had been captured by Turgut Reis, the same man who would later arrive at Malta as one of its besieging commanders. De Valette had spent 12 months chained to an oar, watching Ottoman naval operations from the inside, listening to Ottoman sailors and soldiers talk, learning how they thought, how they planned, what they feared, where they were vulnerable. It was the most expensive education in the world, paid for in humiliation and physical suffering. And he never forgot a single lesson. By the time the Ottoman fleet appeared in 1565, de Valette had been preparing Malta's defences for years. Not weeks, not months, years. He had strengthened the walls of Birgu and Senglea. He had improved Fort St. Elmo, the small, crucial fortress that guarded the entrance to Grand Harbour. He had stockpiled food, ammunition, and water. He had trained the Maltese militia alongside the professional soldiers. He had written repeatedly to the courts of Europe and to the Viceroy of Sicily, Don Garcia de Toledo, warning them that the attack was coming and begging for a commitment of relief forces. Don Garcia had promised relief. Whether that promise would be kept, and when, was a question that would haunt every day of the siege to come. On the Ottoman side, the chain of command was a masterpiece of organizational dysfunction. Suleiman, perhaps mistrustful of any single commander accumulating too much glory, had divided authority in a way that guaranteed conflict. Piale Pasha commanded the fleet, a brilliant naval officer who was primarily concerned with protecting his ships and ensuring they remained anchored safely. Mustafa Pasha commanded the land forces, a veteran general with genuine courage, but also with the dangerous combination of pride and contempt for an enemy he had already decided to underestimate. And then there was Turgut Reis, known to the Europeans as Dragut, the aged corsair who had once enslaved de Valette himself, who held no official title, but whose tactical genius and earned authority made him the most important man in the Ottoman High Command. The problem was that Dragut had not yet arrived when the siege began. 3 commanders, 3 priorities, 3 visions of how the campaign should be fought. And the man best equipped to impose coherence on all 3 was still sailing from Tripoli when the guns opened fire. It was, for the defenders of Malta, the first piece of luck they would receive. It would not be the last. But luck alone was never going to be enough to hold 9,000 against 40,000 for 112 days. That was going to require something far more difficult to manufacture than luck. The island of Malta is, in geological terms, a remnant, a fragment of the ancient limestone shelf that once connected Sicily to North Africa, worn down by millennia of Mediterranean weather into a shape that is equal parts beautiful and punishing. Its hills are bare, its soil is shallow, its stone is the pale golden colour of old bone, and it is everywhere. In the walls, in the roads, in the fortresses, in the cliffs that drop straight into the sea. On a hot summer day, the limestone radiates heat like a furnace. On a still evening, it glows amber in the last light, until the whole island seems to be made of captured sunlight. For a military commander planning a siege, it was a nightmare. The heart of the defensive problem was Grand Harbour, one of the finest natural deep-water harbours in the Mediterranean, a great irregular inlet on the eastern side of the island, where the coastline had fractured into a series of peninsulas and creeks that created miles of sheltered anchorage. Into this harbour jutted 2 narrow peninsulas, like the fingers of an outstretched hand. Birgu to the south, where the knights had built their headquarters, and Senglia to the north, separated from Birgu by a narrow channel called Dockyard Creek. Both peninsulas were guarded by stone walls and bristled with artillery. Both were surrounded by water on 3 sides. Both could be attacked only by crossing open ground or open water, both of which could be swept by cannon fire from the fortifications. At the mouth of Grand Harbour, on a small peninsula of its own, stood Fort St. Elmo. It was not a large fortress. By the standards of European military engineering in the 1560s, it was actually somewhat outdated. A star-shaped design built on a rocky promontory, with walls thick enough to absorb cannon fire, but a perimeter small enough that it could be held by a garrison of only a few hundred men. It controlled the entrance to Grand Harbour entirely. Without Fort St. Elmo, no fleet could anchor safely in the harbour. With it, the harbour was protected. De Valette had looked at this geography and made a calculation that was, depending on your perspective, either brilliantly logical or brutally cold. He knew the Ottomans would need the harbour. Piale Pasha's fleet, 193 ships with tens of thousands of sailors aboard, required a protected anchorage. Without one, the fleet was vulnerable to storms, to Christian relief forces, to the grinding wear of spending months at anchor in open water. The Ottomans would therefore need to neutralize Fort St. Elmo before they could feel secure. They would attack it first. De Valette moved his heaviest cannon into Fort St. Elmo. He positioned artillery on the walls of Fort St. Angelo across the harbour to provide flanking fire against anything attacking St. Elmo. He stretched a massive chain boom across the mouth of Dockyard Creek to prevent naval assault against Burgoo and Senglia's waterfront walls. And he waited for the Ottomans to make the mistake he had predicted they would make. The men who would hold these positions came from across the Christian world, bound together by faith, by mercenary contract, or by the simple fact that this island was their home. The 500 Knights of St. John were the elite core of the defence, but they were an elite of a very particular kind. Each knight had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Each had trained for warfare since adolescence. Each represented one of the 8 long national groups that made up the order, from France and Castile to Aragon and England. They wore the 8-pointed cross on their tunics. They prayed multiple times daily, and they fought with a ferocity that men who had seen it described as almost frightening in its calm determination. They were not hot-tempered warriors. They were cold ones. They had been doing this for 2.5 centuries, and they were very, very good at it. Alongside them stood 900 Spanish soldiers, professionals from the tercios, the Spanish infantry formations that were, in 1565, the finest heavy infantry in Europe. Disciplined, experienced, intimately familiar with the mechanics of siege warfare from both sides of the wall, they formed the backbone of the garrison's conventional military strength. 800 Italian soldiers of varying quality filled out the professional contingent. A company of Greek soldiers brought their own experience of Ottoman warfare. And then there were the Maltese, several thousand men who were not soldiers by training, but who possessed the one quality that professional soldiers sometimes lack. They were fighting for their own homes, their own families, their own children. In the weeks before the fleet arrived, de Valette had organized this disparate force with the systematic thoroughness of a man who knew the disorganization in a siege was a death sentence. Every man had an assigned position. Every cannon had an assigned crew. Every stretch of wall had an assigned defender. Food and water had been stockpiled with obsessive care. A siege could last months, and de Valette had learned from Rhodes that the moment your food ran out, the fortress fell, regardless of how brave its garrison might be. Civilian population centres were designated as refuges. Women and children who could be evacuated to the old medieval capital of Mdina in the centre of the island were sent there. Those who remained were put to work, carrying ammunition, tending wounded, repairing walls between bombardments. The arsenal was counted and recounted. The island held approximately 100,000 pounds of gunpowder, roughly 600 cannon of various sizes, and an adequate but not comfortable supply of shot. There was also a supply of a weapon that would prove decisive in the night attacks to come: incendiary material, what the defenders called wildfire, a mixture of substances including quicklime and various combustibles that would ignite on contact with water and could not be extinguished by ordinary means. It was the 16th century equivalent of napalm, and against soldiers attacking in the darkness, it was devastating. Across the island, in the Ottoman camp taking shape to the west and south, the War Council was having an argument. Mustafa Pasha wanted to attack Birgu directly. It was the heart of the Knights' position, their headquarters, their hospital, their stores, the place where de Valette himself commanded. Destroy Birgu, Mustafa argued, and the defence collapsed. The campaign would be over in weeks. Piale Pasha refused. His fleet was anchored in Marsashlok Bay on the southern coast, an adequate but exposed anchorage. As long as Fort St. Elmo stood and Christian ships could use Grand Harbour to resupply the defenders or land relief forces, his fleet was vulnerable. St. Elmo had to fall first. The argument went back and forth. Both men had valid points. Both men were also, to some degree, motivated by considerations of personal honour and institutional interest that had nothing to do with winning the campaign efficiently. In the end, they agreed on St. Elmo, partly because Piale's concern for the fleet was genuinely strategic, and partly because both men had badly underestimated how long taking St. Elmo would require. They expected it to fall in 3 to 4 days. Turgut Reis had not yet arrived from Tripoli. When he finally appeared, days later, he would survey the situation, look at the chosen axis of attack, and say the words that haunted the Ottoman High Command for the rest of the campaign. This was a mistake. The attack should have begun from the other side. But the guns were already in position, the trenches already dug, and the Janissaries already preparing their assault formations. It was too late to start over. In Fort St. Elmo, on the night before the bombardment began, the small garrison of defenders did the things that soldiers have always done in the hours before a fight they know they probably will not survive. They cleaned their weapons. They wrote letters. They prayed. A young French knight, whose name history did not preserve, wrote in his journal that he was not afraid of dying, only of dying badly, of failing when the moment came, and bringing shame on his brothers. An older Spanish soldier reportedly spent the night sharpening his sword with a methodical, almost meditative patience, running the stone along the blade in long, even strokes, not speaking to anyone. De Valette himself walked the walls of Fort St. Angelo alone in the darkness, looking across the harbour at the lights of St. Elmo. He did not sleep. No one who saw him that night reported hearing him speak a single word. The fleet was there. The enemy was there. Everything he had prepared for was now, finally, in motion. He turned away from the water and walked back inside. Phase 1. Fort St. Elmo. The sacrifice. The guns opened on the morning of May 27th, 1565. What that meant, what it physically, materially meant, was this. Somewhere between 50 and 60 heavy Ottoman cannon, some of them among the largest artillery pieces in the world, opened fire simultaneously on a fortress with a perimeter of perhaps 400 yards. The sound did not arrive at Burgu across the harbour as a series of distinct explosions. It arrived as a single sustained roar, a physical pressure in the chest, a vibration in the limestone beneath your feet, a rolling concussion that flattened the air and left a ringing silence afterward that was somehow louder than the noise that had preceded it. The dust rose in great billowing clouds of white and grey. The smell of burning powder drifted across the harbour in the offshore breeze, sharp, acrid, catching in the back of the throat. The air tasted of stone dust and sulphur and something else underneath, something organic and unmistakable, that men who had been in battle before recognized without needing to name. The guns did not stop. Hour after hour, through the morning and into the afternoon, and through the evening and into the next morning, and the morning after that. The Ottoman cannon pounded Fort St. Elmo. Sections of wall crumbled and were rebuilt during lulls. Men were buried in rubble and dug out and put back on the wall. The garrison's own cannon, smaller, fewer, but positioned with care, returned fire and caused casualties among the Ottoman gun crews, but they could not silence the bombardment. On the third day, Mustafa Pasha sent his janissaries forward. The janissaries were the finest infantry the Ottoman Empire produced. Professional soldiers, recruited as children, raised in military households, trained for decades in the arts of war. They moved toward Fort St. Elmo in tight formations, shields overlapping, moving through the dust and smoke with the methodical confidence of men who had taken dozens of fortresses before this one. They reached the outer walls of the fort as darkness fell. They began to climb. The defenders poured wildfire down the walls. The incendiary mixture hit the climbing men and stuck. It burned through chainmail. It burned through leather. It burned through skin. The screaming from the foot of the wall was unlike anything the watching men in Fort St. Angelo had heard before. A sound without parallel, without precedent, without any framework in human experience adequate to contain it. The Janissary assault broke. The survivors pulled back in disorder, dragging their burned and dying colleagues through the dust. But they came back. The next day they came back, and the day after that. Each assault was beaten off. Each assault cost both sides more men than the last. Each assault chewed away a little more of Fort St. Elmo's walls, a little more of its garrison's strength, a little more of the margin between resistance and collapse. 1 week passed, then 2. In Birgu, de Valette watched through his telescope. He knew, because he was honest with himself in a way that few commanders in history have managed to be, that he was spending the men in Fort St. Elmo. He was using their lives as currency, purchasing time with blood. Every day St. Elmo held was a day Don Garcia's relief force could use to assemble in Sicily. Every Ottoman soldier killed at the foot of St. Elmo's walls was a soldier who would never attack Birgu or Senglea. The garrison inside St. Elmo knew this too. Some of them sent a message to de Valette asking permission to attempt a breakout, to fight their way out of the fortress rather than remain to be ground into nothing. De Valette refused. He sent reinforcements instead. Small groups of volunteers who crossed the harbour by boat at night under Ottoman fire, slipping through the darkness to join the men they knew they were going to die with. These were not men who had been ordered to go. They had chosen. 3 weeks into the siege, Turgut Reis arrived. He was in his 70s, older even than de Valette, and he had spent his entire life at war. He had been born in Anatolia, captured by Christian pirates as a young man, served as a galley slave, escaped, and risen to become the most feared corsair in the Mediterranean. He had sacked Tripoli, raided the coasts of Italy and Spain, fought the Knights of Malta a dozen times over the decades, and emerged from every encounter with his reputation enhanced. He understood siege warfare in his bones. He looked at the Ottoman positions around Fort St. Elmo and began issuing corrections with the calm authority of a man who did not need to raise his voice to be obeyed. He repositioned gun batteries. He opened new trenches. He tightened the blockade. Under his direction, the pressure on St. Elmo intensified in ways that were immediately and horribly apparent to the men inside. Phase 2. Dragut dies. The turning within the turning. On the morning of June 18th, 1565, Turgut Reis was supervising the positioning of a new battery of guns on the rocky ground near the tip of the Skiberas Peninsula, directly across the mouth of the harbour from Fort St. Elmo. It was dangerous work, dangerously close to Fort St. Angelo's cannon. But Turgut moved among his men with the easy fearlessness of a man who had survived so many close calls that he had simply stopped counting. A cannon shot from Fort St. Angelo struck the rocky ground near where he stood. The ball did not hit him, but the impact sent a spray of stone fragments outward in all directions, and one of those fragments, a piece of limestone the size of a man's fist, struck Turgut Reis in the head. He did not fall immediately. He stood for a moment, swaying slightly, his hands still reaching forward as if to continue his gesture of instruction. Then his men caught him and eased him to the ground. Blood ran from a wound at his temple. His eyes were open but not seeing. He was alive, but barely. Word spread through the Ottoman camp with terrible speed. Mustafa Pasha rode immediately to where Turgut lay and looked down at the motionless figure of the man who had, in barely 2 weeks, transformed a stalled siege into a working one. He ordered a tent erected around the wounded admiral, and he ordered a curtain hung across the entrance, so that the soldiers passing by could not see their greatest commander lying insensible in the dust. But armies are not fooled by curtains. They know when something fundamental has changed. Turgut Reis lay dying. He was not dead yet. He would not die for several more days, lingering at the edge of consciousness, while the battle he had shaped continued without him. But the Ottoman army felt his absence immediately, like a man who has lost a limb and keeps reaching for things that are no longer there. The tactical clarity he had brought to the siege, the quiet confidence that had radiated from him as he walked among the gun crews and the janissary officers, all of that evaporated with the stone fragment that had struck him down. Mustafa Pasha pressed the assault on Fort St. Elmo with renewed fury. Not from wisdom, but from grief and frustration, and the urgent need to show that the death of Dragut had not changed anything fundamental. He threw his best units at the walls. He authorized night assaults, dawn assaults, assaults in the heat of midday. He brought forward his siege artillery to point-blank range. The walls were crumbling now, not metaphorically, literally. Great sections had been reduced to rubble, and the defenders were building new barriers from the rubble of the old ones, stacking broken stone and timber in the breaches, pouring water on the dust to pack it solid. The garrison was down to a few hundred effective fighters from the several hundred who had started. Wounded men who could no longer stand were being propped against the walls in sitting positions with weapons in their hands, so that attacking janissaries would see more defenders than actually existed. Phase 3. Fort St. Elmo falls. 1,500 versus 8,000. June 23rd, 1565. The 28th day of the bombardment. Before dawn, the Ottoman guns opened with everything they had. A final, obliterating barrage that reduced the last standing sections of Fort St. Elmo's walls to rubble. In the pre-dawn darkness, the janissaries moved forward for what everyone on both sides of the harbour understood would be the final assault. The garrison fought them in the rubble, not from behind walls anymore, because there were no walls, just broken stone and twisted iron, and the bodies of men who had died in the previous 27 days of fighting. The defenders fought from behind improvised barricades, from doorways, from the ruins of buildings that had been blasted open by cannon fire. They fought with swords and pikes and arquebus and bare hands. They fought until there were none of them left to fight. In the last hours, 9 men of the Maltese garrison chose not to die. They stripped off their armour in the darkness, slipped over the seaward wall of the fort, and dropped into the water of Grand Harbour. Then they swam, 300 yards across open water, under Ottoman fire, in the dark, toward the walls of Fort St. Angelo on the other side. The cannonballs struck the water around them in great white columns. The musket fire pocked the surface in a moving curtain of spray. 8 of the 9 made it. They were pulled from the water by their brothers on the far shore, half drowned and shaking, and brought before de Valette, who embraced each of them in silence. Fort St. Elmo fell at first light. Turgut Reis died. Whether from his wound or from news of the fort's fall, history leaves ambiguous, on the same morning. It was as if he had held on just long enough to see the objective achieved, and then let go. Mustafa Pasha walked through the ruins of the fort afterward, stepping over the bodies of the defenders. He saw what it had taken to put those bodies there. He had lost, by various estimates, somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 men in 28 days. 8,000 men, more than the entire defending garrison of Malta, to take a fortress smaller than a city block. He stood among the ruins and reportedly said words to this effect: "If this small son has cost us so dear, what will we pay for the father?" He was looking across the harbour at Fort St. Angelo, but before he could turn his attention to the father, the psychological war had to be fought. Mustafa Pasha ordered the bodies of the fallen knights decapitated. The heads were placed on stakes around the harbour. The headless bodies were lashed to wooden crosses and pushed into the water, to float across Grand Harbour toward Fort St. Angelo. De Valette watched them arrive. He said nothing. He walked to the nearest battery of cannon, ordered the crew to load with chain shot, and gave the command to execute every Ottoman prisoner held in the fortress. The heads were loaded into the cannon. They were fired across the harbour toward the Ottoman camp. The message required no translation. Phase 4. The Desperate Hold, July through August. With Fort St. Elmo gone, Mustafa Pasha turned to the main objective, Birgu and Senglia, the twin peninsulas where the bulk of the defensive garrison had been waiting through 6 weeks of bombardment. His force was now somewhere below 30,000 men. The losses at St. Elmo had been severe. But he still outnumbered the defenders by a ratio that made success look inevitable. He had the men. He had the guns. He had the summer months ahead of him before the autumn storms made the Mediterranean dangerous. He did not have Turgut Reis, and he was about to discover exactly how much that mattered. The assault plan was layered and on paper sound. A force of Janissaries would attack Fort St. Michael at the tip of the Senglia Peninsula from the landward side. Simultaneously, a fleet of small boats, perhaps 80 vessels carrying roughly 1,000 of the Ottoman army's best soldiers, would row around the tip of the Senglia Peninsula and attack its seaward walls from the water. If both attacks hit simultaneously, the defenders would have to split their already depleted garrison. If either one broke through, the peninsula would be enveloped from 2 sides at once. The boats launched in the early morning hours, hugging the coastline to avoid detection for as long as possible. They rounded the tip of the peninsula and turned toward the seaward walls of Senglia. The men in the boats could see the walls above them, apparently unmanned, and the confidence of the Janissaries in those boats. The elite of the elite, men who had never known defeat, was perhaps not unreasonable. What they did not know was that a French knight named Chevalier de Guiral had, weeks earlier, positioned a battery of 4 cannon on a low stone platform along the waterfront, directly in the path the assault boats would need to travel. The battery was invisible from the water, screened by the natural curve of the shore. The cannon were loaded with chain shot, lengths of heavy iron chain that, when fired, spread apart in the air and cut through grouped men like a scythe through wheat. De Guiral waited until the boats were 200 yards away. Then he gave the order. 4 cannon fired simultaneously into the packed assault boats. 4 cannons, chain shot, 200 yards, 1,000 men crammed into 80 small vessels. The effect was not a military outcome. It was a catastrophe. The chain ripped through the boats in great tearing arcs, hitting men and oars and hull planks indiscriminately, capsizing vessels, throwing bodies into the water, transforming the ordered assault formation into a screaming chaos of overturned boats and struggling men in heavy armour, drowning in the harbour. Perhaps 800 of the 1,000 men in those boats died in the first minutes after the guns fired. But the Janissaries on land were still coming. They reached the walls of Sanglier in waves, climbing over the rubble from the previous weeks of bombardment, pushing through breaches in the outer defences, fighting their way street by street through the town toward the inner fortifications. The defenders fell back before them, trading ground for time, using the familiar warren of Maltese limestone streets to channel the attackers into killing grounds. A breach opened in one section of the wall, a genuine breach, a gap wide enough for an Ottoman column to push through and begin to roll up the defence from inside. De Valette was informed of the breach. He was 71 years old. He had a dozen advisers urging him to remain at headquarters, to coordinate the response from a position of safety. He ignored all of them. He picked up a pike, a 14-foot infantry weapon designed for men decades younger, and walked toward the breach. His presence there, the Grand Master himself, an old man in armour, standing in a gap in the wall with a pike levelled at the advancing Janissaries, changed something in the men around him. There are moments in battles when the intangible matters as much as the tactical, when the sight of one person refusing to yield produces in hundreds of other people the same refusal. This was one of those moments. The men around de Valette held. The breach was sealed with rubble and bodies and sheer physical resistance. The Janissary column was pushed back. Through July and into August, the pattern repeated itself. Bombardment followed by assault. Assault beaten back. New breach opened. New section of wall lost and then retaken. The garrison was shrinking, not catastrophically, not yet, but steadily, in the way that a candle shrinks, slowly and then, suddenly, dangerously short. Disease had begun to work through the defenders alongside the cannon and the swords. In August, the Ottomans achieved something they hadn't managed in 3 months. They got a substantial force over the walls and into the streets of Birgu itself. For a period of perhaps 30 minutes, it appeared possible, genuinely, terrifyingly possible, that the defence had finally broken. Ottoman soldiers were inside the perimeter. The fighting was building to building, doorway to doorway. The inner walls of the fortress were the only thing between the Janissaries and the harbour. Then something happened that no one on either side had planned. A small cavalry patrol commanded by a knight named Anastagi had been stationed in the western part of the island for exactly this kind of situation, to watch for flanking movements, to respond to threats that the main garrison couldn't address. In the confusion of the August assault, most of the Ottoman camp's rearguard had been pulled forward to support the main attack on Birgu. The camp was thinly held, largely empty. Essentially unguarded, Anastagi saw his opportunity and took it. He led his cavalry across the open ground toward the Ottoman rear camp and hit it hard. Horses at full gallop, sabres out in the clear, bright morning light. The sound of cavalry behind the lines sent a message through the Ottoman command structure that overrode everything else. Relief forces, the Christian Relief Army from Sicily, had arrived. Mustafa Pasha received the report and made the decision every commander dreads. He pulled back. The soldiers inside Birgu were ordered to withdraw. The entire assault was broken off. The breach was abandoned. The men who had been 30 minutes from potentially breaking the defence were retreating across the open ground outside the walls. By the time Mustafa Pasha established that it was not the Sicilian Relief Army, but a single company of cavalry, the moment was gone. The breach had been sealed. The garrison had caught its breath. The defenders, who had been on the edge of collapse, had pulled themselves back from that edge and found, in the brief respite that Anastagi's mad charge had purchased, the reserves they needed to keep going. Phase 5. The Grande Soccorso, September 7th. By the first week of September, the Ottoman army had been on Malta for 112 days. The numbers told one story. The Ottoman force, which had arrived with 40,000 men, was down to perhaps 20,000 effective fighters, with thousands more sick, wounded, or exhausted beyond usefulness. The defenders, who had started with 9,000, had lost perhaps a third of their effective strength. The walls of Birgu and Senglir were barely recognizable as walls anymore. They were continuous mounds of rubble, patched and repatched so many times that no section had been unbroken for more than a few days at a stretch. But there is another kind of number that matters in a long siege, and that is the number of days. Each day the defenders held was a day the relief force in Sicily had to assemble and sail. Each morning the Ottoman army woke to find the island still not taken, was a morning in which the campaign drifted further from the swift, decisive victory that Suleiman had expected, and closer to the sort of grinding, inconclusive failure that destroys armies and reputations with equal thoroughness. September 7th, 1565. Don Garcia de Toledo, Viceroy of Sicily, landed approximately 8,000 Spanish soldiers on the northern shore of Malta at St. Paul's Bay. They came ashore at dawn, moving quickly, establishing their position on the high ground above the beach before the Ottoman lookouts could react. From the walls of Birgu, men who had been fighting for more than 3 months saw the glint of Spanish armour on the distant hillside and felt something they had almost forgotten how to feel. Mustafa Pasha faced a decision. His army still outnumbered the Spanish landing force. He could re-embark his troops and attempt to defeat the relief force in open battle before it linked up with the garrison in Birgu. He gave the order to re-embark. His men began pulling back toward the ships. Then word came that the Spanish force was larger than initially reported. Reports from Ottoman scouts, confused, contradictory, probably wrong, suggested that the landing force might number 15 or 20,000 rather than 8. Mustafa Pasha halted the re-embarkation. He ordered his troops back ashore. He drew them up in battle formation to meet the Spanish advance. The battle that followed was brief and decisive in a way that 3.5 months of siege had not been. The Ottoman army that had arrived in May had been 40,000 strong, blooded, confident, fresh from victories across the Mediterranean. The Ottoman army that met the Spanish relief force in September was neither fresh nor confident. They were men who had spent 3.5 months trying to break a fortress that would not break, watching their colleagues die at the foot of walls that rebuilt themselves overnight, losing their greatest commander to a piece of flying stone, and fighting in the merciless heat of a Maltese summer with inadequate water and the growing suspicion that the island was simply not going to fall. They broke. Not immediately, not without fighting, but within hours of contact with the Spanish relief force, the Ottoman formations began to lose cohesion. Units that had stood their ground for months under circumstances of extraordinary difficulty simply turned and walked away. The withdrawal became a rout. Mustafa Pasha, desperate to salvage something from the wreckage, attempted to reorganize and launch a final assault on the Spanish positions. His soldiers refused. On September 11th, 1565, the Ottoman fleet raised anchor and sailed away from Malta. The sea was calm. The autumn light was clear and golden. The fortress walls, battered beyond recognition, still stood. The men who had held them, or most of them, were still alive. And across the harbour, the water that had been choked with warships since May lay empty and still, reflecting nothing but sky. The counting began before the ships had disappeared over the horizon. The numbers were staggering in both directions, and historians have spent centuries arguing over the precise figures. Because the precise figures matter less than their general shape. The Ottoman force that arrived in May had numbered somewhere between 35,000 and 40,000 men. The Ottoman force that sailed away in September had lost, depending on which account you read, between 25,000 and 35,000 dead, killed by cannon fire, by sword, by wildfire, by disease, by thirst, by the simple grinding attrition of 4 months of failed assault against an enemy who refused to stop fighting. Francisco Balbi di Correggio, who was there, and who wrote the most detailed eyewitness account of the siege, counted 35,000 Ottoman dead. Other contemporary sources put the figure somewhat lower. But even the most conservative estimates agree on this. The Ottoman Empire sailed away from Malta, having lost the majority of the force it had sent there. On the defending side, the losses were smaller in absolute terms, but devastating in proportion. Of the approximately 9,000 defenders who had begun the siege, roughly 2,500 were dead. Several thousand more were wounded in various degrees of severity. The Maltese population, which had endured 4 months of bombardment, siege conditions, and everything that follows in the wake of concentrated warfare, had lost perhaps a third of its people to combat, to disease, to the simple, brutal mathematics of being caught between the largest armies the era could produce. Mustafa Pasha returned to Istanbul with his diminished army and his broken reputation. Some accounts describe him being brought before Suleiman's court to give account of himself. At least one source suggests that the Sultan, in his fury at the outcome, had Mustafa beaten before his assembled officials. Whether or not that specific detail is accurate, the career of Mustafa Pasha never recovered from Malta. He was a competent general who had been given an impossible situation. 3 months of siege against a garrison that should have fallen in weeks, and had failed to solve it. The Ottoman Empire, which rewarded victory with everything and failure with nothing, had no use for a man who presided over the greatest military humiliation of the century. Piale Pasha fared somewhat better, because his fleet was essentially intact. 193 ships had arrived, and 193 ships sailed home. But intact ships and a lost campaign are a difficult combination to explain to a sultan who expected conquest. And Piale's name, too, would forever after be associated with the word Malta, in a way that gave his admirers nothing to celebrate. In Istanbul, Suleiman the Magnificent received the news in silence. He had been on campaign himself, a final punishing campaign in Hungary that was consuming the last of his remarkable physical strength. He was 70 years old. He had ruled for 45 years. He had won more battles and conquered more territory than any European or Muslim ruler in memory. And now the Knights of St. John, the same knights he had expelled from Rhodes 4 decades earlier, the same ragged order he had given a worthless island as consolation, had held against his full power. Contemporary sources differ on exactly what Suleiman said when he heard the news, but several agree that he said very little. What he apparently felt, and what he apparently expressed in private conversations afterward, was not rage, but something quieter and in some ways more painful. The recognition that something he had believed about his own power, something the whole world had believed about his empire, had turned out not to be entirely true. In Birgu and Senglea, the aftermath looked the way aftermath always looks. Profoundly, almost peacefully wrong. The walls that had shaken under the impact of over 100,000 cannonballs stood, but barely. Whole sections had been reduced to rubble and rebuilt from that rubble so many times that they retained almost nothing of their original structure. The streets of Birgu were cratered, uneven, full of collapsed buildings. The smell of the city in the weeks after the siege, old smoke, lime dust, blood that had dried and been rained on and dried again, was one that survivors described decades later as something they could never quite get out of their minds. Jean de Valette walked through it. He was described by those who saw him in the days after the Ottoman withdrawal as looking unchanged. Not victorious, not triumphant, just the same, thin, upright, dry-eyed, moving through the wreckage of the city he had defended with the same measured stride he had used when those streets were whole. He spoke quietly to the men he passed. He gave orders about burials and medical care and food distribution with the same calm specificity he had used when giving orders about cannon placement and troop movements. If he felt the weight of what the island had survived, he did not show it in any way that anyone thought to record. The knights attended a mass of thanksgiving in the church of St. Lawrence in Birgu. The service was not jubilant. It was the kind of service held by people who have come through something enormous and are not yet sure what it means. Grateful to be alive in a way that takes up all the space inside you and leaves no room for celebration. Suleiman the Magnificent launched one more campaign in 1566. Into Hungary, his old hunting ground, the place where his power had been most spectacular in his younger decades. He did not live to complete it. He died in his tent at the siege of Szigetvar on September 7th, 1566, exactly 1 year after the Ottoman fleet had raised anchor and sailed away from Malta. He never led another campaign. He never sent another fleet to reclaim the island that had turned back his greatest armada. The debt he had promised himself he would collect from the Knights of St. John remained unpaid at his death, and the empire he left behind would never again possess quite the same absolute confidence in its own invincibility that it had carried into Malta harbour in May of 1565. The bells of every church in Malta rang for 3 days without stopping. The silence that settled over Malta in the autumn of 1565 was the silence of a world holding its breath. Every court in Europe understood within weeks what had happened on the limestone island in the centre of the sea. The dispatches that arrived in Madrid and Rome and Paris and Vienna told the same story in different hands. The Ottoman army, the most powerful military force in the world, had sent 40,000 men against 9,000 defenders, and the 9,000 had not moved. Philip II of Spain, receiving the news in Madrid, sat with the report in his hands for a long time before he spoke. Then he said reportedly words that became the definitive statement of Malta's strategic importance. Without Malta, nothing. Without Sicily, nothing. Without Naples, nothing. Without Italy, nothing. The falling dominoes stopped at Malta. and Europe knew it.
The immediate military consequences were significant, but not instantaneous. The Ottoman Empire did not collapse. It did not even retreat. In 1566, Suleiman launched his Hungarian campaign, and his successors continued to push Ottoman borders in various directions for decades afterward. The Ottomans were wounded, not broken. They would rebuild their fleet, recruit new janissaries, fill the treasury from their vast empire, and remain a dominant force in Mediterranean politics for another century and a half. But something had changed that could not be changed back. Before Malta, the Ottoman Empire had a reputation, forged over a century of consistent, stunning military victories, as a force that could not be stopped, only slowed. Armies that faced the Ottomans knew in their bones that the odds were against them. Fortresses that the Ottomans besieged fell. Cities that the Ottomans surrounded eventually surrendered. The psychological weight of that history was itself a weapon, and it had won battles before a single cannon was fired. Malta broke that reputation. Not completely, not permanently, but in the way that matters most, which is the way that lives inside the people who have to make decisions in moments of crisis. The officers and soldiers who had watched Rhodes fall, who had heard about Mohacs and Belgrade and Constantinople and all the rest of the catalogue of Ottoman conquest, now had a different story to tell. It was possible. It could be done. 9,000 people had done it against 40,000 for 112 days, and the 40,000 had gone home with their fleet intact and their hearts, for the first time in a very long time, not entirely certain of themselves. 6 years later, at the Battle of Lepanto in October 1571, a combined Christian fleet met the Ottoman navy in the Gulf of Patras and destroyed it. The battle was decisive in the way that Malta had not been. A single engagement, one day, 2 fleets, thousands of men and ships, reduced to debris on a calm sea. The Ottoman navy, which had dominated the Mediterranean for generations, was broken at Lepanto and never quite recovered. Historians debate the long-term significance of Lepanto endlessly, but they agree on one thing. Lepanto was possible partly because of Malta. Because Malta proved that the Ottoman Empire could be hurt. Because the men who fought at Lepanto, the commanders, the admirals, the soldiers in the galleys, knew, going into that engagement, that Suleiman's heirs were not invincible. They had the example of a limestone island and 9,000 people to remind them. The Knights of St. John remained on Malta. Where else would they go? In the months after the siege, Jean de Valette made a decision that was simultaneously practical and symbolic. The old city of Birgu was too damaged, its position too exposed, its streets too cramped for the kind of modern fortification that the experience of the siege had shown was necessary. A new city would be built, on the tip of the Skiberas Peninsula, on the exact ground where Dragut had died, and where the guns that bombarded Fort St. Elmo had stood, on the bones of the Ottoman failure. It would be a planned city, built from nothing, designed by military engineers according to the most modern principles of fortification, with wide streets and proper drainage, and walls that incorporated every lesson the siege had taught about the limits of stone and the ingenuity of attackers. De Valette laid the first stone on March 28, 1566, in a formal ceremony that the knights attended in full regalia. He was 72 years old. He would live to see the foundations laid and the first buildings begun, before dying in 1568, not in battle, but in the quiet indignity of a stroke suffered during a hunting expedition. He was buried in the new city. They named it
Valletta. It is the capital of the nation of Malta today. Its streets are limestone, the colour of old bone. Its fortifications are still standing, still looking out over Grand Harbour, still marking the geography that de Valette understood in his bones. The water approaches, the angles of fire, the narrow peninsulas that could be held by determined men against force many times their own. The harbour is different now. There are no warships anchored where Piale Pasha's fleet once stood. There are yachts and ferries, and the colourful traditional boats called luzus, painted in bright reds and yellows and blues. Tourists walk the ramparts in the afternoon light, looking out at the same view that de Valette looked at in the early morning hours of May 1565, when the Ottoman fleet came over the horizon like a jewelled serpent across the face of the water. Voltaire, who was not given to extravagance, said the thing that needed to be said about the siege as simply as he could. Nothing is more famous than the Siege of Malta. He was right. But famous is too small a word for what actually happened there. What happened in Malta in 1565 was not simply a battle or a siege or a military campaign. It was a proof that mathematics, 40,000 against 9,000, does not determine outcomes. That the same empire that had conquered Rhodes and Belgrade and Constantinople and the armies of Persia and Egypt and Hungary could be stopped by a small island in the middle of the sea, held by men who had nowhere else to go and nothing to offer except the fact that they were still there, still fighting, still standing on walls that kept breaking and rebuilding themselves in the night. The 9,000 did not win because they were better soldiers than the 40,000, though some of them were. They did not win because they had better weapons, or better tactics, or better commanders, though they had some of those things. They won because they made a choice that the 40,000 could not ultimately match. The choice to stay. Fort St. Elmo's garrison chose to stay when they could have asked to leave. The volunteers who crossed the harbour at night chose to join men they knew they would probably die with. De Valette chose to walk toward the breach with a pike when he was 71 years old, and the world's most powerful military force was on the other side of it. The Maltese farmers and fishermen chose to stand on walls they had never trained to defend, against soldiers who had spent their entire lives learning how to take fortresses apart. The Ottoman Empire had everything. The men of Malta had a choice. Centuries later, the harbour is quiet. The stones are warm in the afternoon light. The same sea that carried 193 warships on a May morning in 1565 now carries nothing more threatening than the afternoon ferry from Sicily. The walls are full of tourists taking photographs. Children run along the ramparts, laughing at nothing in particular, the way children always laugh when the catastrophe is sufficiently far in the past. But the walls are still there. And on the tip of the old peninsula, where the fort stood and fell, and where a new city rose from the rubble, the stone records the most important truth of all. That in the summer of 1565, 9,000 people looked at 40,000 and made a decision. They decided they were not going to move, and they didn't.